What's up guys, this is Darkbblue, a gamer who loves Souls-like games, looter games, and every game that involves build making. With the huge success of From Software's Souls series, there have been more and more Souls-like games recently. However, most of them are even below the average quality, and there must be something wrong. Now, as a player who has been playing Souls series from Dark Souls 1 and has also played many Souls-like games, I shall share my understanding of the essence of Souls games. But I shall first make some claims. I am but a player, not any game developer, so I'm only making analysis based on the information that a player has access to. And although I have played Souls games a lot, I have very limited knowledge of other game genres. Okay, that's it. Now don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive right into it. First of all, I want to propose a phrase, Souls Paradigm, which is the basis of all Souls games. So what's it? It's the basic combat mechanic of a Souls game. In a word, Souls Paradigm is a highly simplified combat design without any fancy mechanics. There is only the most basic interaction between enemies and the player, timing your dodge or parry, and a rough sense of distance. It might be helpful for understanding if we compare Souls Paradigm with other games. Traditional action games like Devil May Cry offer very complicated combat mechanics, allowing you to perform crazy combos. Compared with them, Souls Paradigm is much simpler. However, compared to typical RPG games like Elder Scrolls, Souls Paradigm is still more like an action game. So it's safe to say that Souls Paradigm is the minimal requirement if you want an action game. The advantage of adopting Souls Paradigm is that games become much easier to produce. Most teams can make it and even spare much time to spend on other aspects of their games, but the drawback is also obvious. Such Souls Paradigm is not fun at all. This leads us to my key conclusion. Any Souls game must provide the player with additional gaming elements beyond Souls Paradigm, which is the key to making it fun. So let's assume that we take Demon Souls combat out and make it an arena game where you fight endlessly without experiencing any dungeon design or lore. And it's boring, isn't it? Now, as you may have guessed, the reason why the Souls series comes to today's success is that From Software has put a lot of additional elements into their games. This procedure starts at Demon Souls. Map design, art, and lore, they have become the foundation of almost every Souls game and Souls-like game. Let's call them MAL for short, as they will show up repeatedly in this video. But more is just all that Demon Souls has to offer. Then we come to Dark Souls 1, where From Software is at least trying to make combat better. The greatest breakthrough is the introduction of poise. Back in Demon Souls, if a certain attack cannot stagger an enemy, it'll stay so forever. But with the poise mechanic, you can eventually stagger an enemy with the accumulation of multiple hits. This leads to a better balance between different weapons types, but it's not fun yet. Dark Souls 2 is where the Souls series begin to be fun in combat. This is the result of interesting interactions between enemies and the player. Note that the interaction always exists as it's part of Souls Paradigm, but it's not always fun. So why does Dark Souls 2 have interesting interactions? Dodging or parrying an attack used to be only about timing, but in Dark Souls 2, with the help of accurate hitboxes and deliberately designed blind zones of an attack, it is possible to evade an attack by simply standing in a certain position, and this makes dodging a two-dimensional activity, which is much more fun. However, this feature is not present in every Souls game after Dark Souls 2. For example, Bloodborne is not very dedicated to this. Since we are already talking about Bloodborne, what's special about it? Its breakable body parts. By accumulating damage dealt to a body part, you can break it and stagger a giant beast enemy. Since there are usually multiple body parts composing a giant enemy, it is possible to chain these daggers and make bosses stunned until death. Although this mechanic is consistent and generic, different bosses can present different body part designs, which provides a diverse game experience. You can count it as a single yet complex combat mechanic. As you can see, Dark Souls 2 tries to make this game more fun by interesting interaction, while Bloodborne chooses to approach it through interesting enemy mechanic design. When the time comes to Dark Souls 3, FS chooses to combine them together. Dark Souls 3 has absorbed the accurate hitboxes from Dark Souls 2 and adopted a simplified version of Bloodborne's body part mechanic. And in addition to this, Dark Souls 3 also adds something new, which is accessible high-impact attack moves that can knock enemies down. Although each of these elements is simpler than they used to be, Dark Souls 3 is still fun to play as there are so many different elements. You can fight each enemy with the help of different combat designs. Next, we have Sekiro. Well, I know some may disagree that this is a Souls game, but you will see that it still follows From Software's evolution routine. Okay, from Bloodborne to Dark Souls 3, two games have been devoted to exploring enemy mechanics and strategic combat. Now FS thinks it's time to turn back to interesting interaction. So we get a parry-centric combat, which will be analyzed in detail in another video. So far, every Souls game has been about how to design better combat. It's a curious choice, as From Software simplified combat to Souls paradigm at first, and then thinks, well, no, such simple combat is not what we want. The final result is a new fashion of action games. You don't have to be skillful, but you need to observe and think. FS turns combat into a strategic thing. With such huge success, Elden Ring is a brave decision. FS retreats back to the original point with Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1 and goes on a different path. This time, the emphasis is on map design, which leads to the very first open-world Souls games. After reviewing the full Souls series evolution history, we can make two conclusions. First, even the most authentic Souls game developed by From Software must contain some additional elements to be fun. And second, although From Software has tried some approaches, they are not the only possible path. As a result, let me make a claim which may sound very stupid at first. I know From Software's Souls series is the origin of all Souls games, the most authentic and best among all, and the very reason why this genre is called Souls games. But it is not the standard for Souls games. A standard is something that everyone should follow, but Souls series only shows us one or at most maybe two possibilities of making a good Souls game. As for other possibilities, it's time to look at Souls-like games. The most common approach of making a Souls-like game is simply adopting the old MAL. Of course, in this way, combat will be very boring. Well, this problem is not hard to notice, so solutions have been proposed. Typically, fancy martial arts, skills, spells, or weapons will be designed, but they can never truly form a logical framework. So I call this design beginner-level build-centric combat. Well, if you want to know what it looks like without playing at a Souls-like game that may ruin your day, just take a look at Elden Ring's combat. As stated before, Elden Ring is all about map design, and its combat has been downgraded. Its combat is just a typical example of beginner-level build-centric combat. You do have some components that can possibly be utilized to make a build, but it's too far away from good looter and build games. So what's the possible output of this approach? Okay, even if a lucky team produced a Souls-like game with MAL design at the same level as Dark Souls 1, Man, do you really understand when Dark Souls 1 was released? Producing a game of the same level as such an old game is not that worth appreciation, and we know not a single Souls-like game that follows this approach has reached this level. So some even have worse combat than Dark Souls 1. As a result, this is never a suggested approach, but it seems it's just too easy to spot. So many teams are still working on it and producing many throwaway Souls-like games. Well, they are not necessarily bad. They have novel maps and fancy art along with lore. Beginner level build-centric combat at least means you won't get bored too soon. So you will still have a good experience when playing them for the first few times. But ever after that, they don't worth your replaying, just throw them away. I know this is the common way of playing, even for From Software Soul series, where there are actually very interesting combat designs. So these throwaway Souls-like games aren't really that bad. Well, I am glad to say that there are Souls-like games with better design. One approach that has been chosen by more than one team is real build-centric combat. Both Code Vein and the Ramen series have chosen it. On one hand, they follow the practice of looter games to design build-centric combat. On the other, they abandon random attributes and adopt Soul series practice that most gears are easy to get and every gear of the same name has the same stats. And this indeed leads to promising results. I think we can understand this approach in this way. We have to admit that designing good enemy mechanics like From Software does is too hard for us, but build-centric combat is much easier as there are so many looter games we can refer to. This seems to be a good approach as all the 3 games that use this approach achieve good results. As for other ideas, we only have single cases. For example, The Surge is a Souls-like version of Infinity Blade, which means it's highly focused on interaction. Well, do you know Infinity Blade? It's a very typical mobile game, a very good one, not like the gacha mobile games today. I don't like The Surge personally, but we have to admit it does have something unique. In summary, I think the key to a good Souls game is to find some additional gaming elements beyond Souls paradigm. MAL plus beginner level build-centric combat is a safe choice and at least playable for most players, but I still hope we can get better designed Souls games. If you like my story and if you want to join me into depth of games, just like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, see you around.